For millennia, spiritual thinkers have offered wisdom and tools to help people find their way in trying times. Advice that even scientists like me find have a lot to offer. Join me, Dave DeSteno, as I talk to leading spiritual and scientific thinkers about everything from the ancient origins of belief to the power of prayer, even for atheists, to how spirituality can help the crisis of meaning men are facing today. Find our show, How God Works, wherever you listen to podcasts.
This is the final service. I'm Matteo Schimpf. All right, this is our last stop. Here we go. Everything I need? Yeah.
There's like one word could be used to describe every ethnicity in a way. You know, like the Swedes are organized, the Germans are diligent, the French are romantic, the Italians cook, but the Lithuanians are tenacious.
Christian Allyn is proud to be Lithuanian.
They will never stop. If they are determined, they will fight to the bitter end, whether they live on or not. And I discovered that part of myself is this. And here I am to fight.
He's 30 years old, from a small town in northern Connecticut called Canaan. His family's been running a mining operation there since the 1800s. And the thing that Christian is fighting for is a church. A big, red brick church on the corner of a Flatiron Street in Waterbury, Connecticut.
Waterbury is always a place of death. You'd look at Waterbury, buildings were falling apart, shootings, crime, everybody was down on it. Forget that place, it's over. It's done.
Waterbury is a blue-collar city, about 100,000 people. European immigrants flocked there to support the city's booming brass industry a couple hundred years ago. It was actually once deemed the brass capital of the world. But these days, people like to call Waterbury a gritty city, and its residents resent that.
I never accepted that. And so I said, here I am being called to be Lithuanian, go to St. Joseph's on Epiphany Sunday. Boom, here we are.
The place we are now, as in during the recording of my interview with Christian, is the dining room table of his second-floor apartment in Brooklyn.
This is like my second home.
That's the name of a section in Waterbury that from about 1890 to 1990 was the most Lithuanian neighborhood in the most Lithuanian city in the state. And if you can imagine Brooklyn as its own little universe, with Lithuanian delis and hardware stores and tax offices, then at its center was St. Joseph's. It's a Catholic church that, in 2023, was handed a stay of execution by the Archdiocese in Hartford, and one that Christian has dedicated his life to saving. That's the journey he'd take me on. It's a story that, strangely, doesn't start when he was a small boy sitting in the pews at St. Joseph's, or in a classroom at the parish school next door. It starts just a few years ago, when Brooklyn and Waterbury were the furthest things from his mind. Christian was 24 years old and finally moving out of his parents' house. He'd spent 9 days praying for this, in something called the Novena Prayer, at the direction of his priest in Canaan, Father Dawson. On the 9th day of his novena, Christian's prayers were answered. A local contractor he'd been working with asked him if he wanted to manage an estate just across the border in New York, in a little town called Armenia. Christian actually knew the place, called it the Big Red House.
I remember going by this house in 5th grade, looking at it and saying to myself, people who live better than the best life I could ever imagine live there.
In exchange for looking after the property, he got to live in the big red house of his dreams, rent-free. But Christian was also alone. It's something he dealt with a lot in life.
I was definitely an inside kid. My parents got, a Windows 98 computer, and I plugged right into that, and I would play those games in kind of like a meditative state.
Christian said that growing up, he was less rowdy than the other boys in school, wasn't really involved with girls, and so he got mocked. Kids called him gay, told him he was a creep.
Especially in 4th grade, and I had to be held back for that. So it was mocked so much that I'd just go home from school and cry all night.
So Christian learned to survive as an outsider, but he still wasn't ready for how lonely life would get in the Big Red House.
The path that led me here really happened in 2021. I was losing about one person a week during COVID.
If that sounds unusual for a 25-year-old to be losing one person a week during the pandemic, it's because it is. Without friends his own age at school, Christian got close with some of the older folks around town.
And I was calling people, relentlessly to check in because I hadn't seen them for months, and telling them I loved them because I didn't know what was going to happen.
Like the rest of us, Christian was anxiously following the news, watching in horror as refrigerated trailers in New York and Chicago and LA filled up with bodies, checking social media to see if he could find out anything about anyone he knew, shuttered in their homes, all alone.
I went to bed and I looked on Facebook and I found that 2 more people died.
These deaths felt really personal to Christian. One woman was a 30-year-old schoolteacher from his hometown. The other one he describes as a sort of matriarch figure there.
I prayed and I said, God, you've given me all of this. I have this amazing business. I'm here. I have this amazing house. And it's all going well for me, but the world's not going well. And all these people are dead. And there's something missing in my life and I don't know what it is. What is it?
Christian said it was a wintry night in Armenia. He was praying, watching the snow fall out the window. And then it hit him.
Clear as day. Be Lithuanian.
Christian went on a trip to Lithuania with his grandmother after college, but said he felt disconnected from that side of his family when he came back to the States. Wasn't really sure what to do about it.
And that just weighed on me. I'm like, I could be that? I could actually be Lithuanian and be a part of that here? I'm going to go for this.
This is something Christian did a lot during the course of our conversation, and it made for some confusing moments. He'd often answer my questions with allegories and abstractions, language about heritage, transformation, fate.
The ethnicity that in my heritage is of the most need to the world and also to myself is Lithuanian. It is so rare to be a Lithuanian, and it is so completely not understood through the wider world.
Sometimes that felt complicated. The ways that Christian would enmesh his Lithuanian identity with his religious beliefs. Like it was straddling the line between a proud heritage and something more problematic. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Was he on a crusade to be Lithuanian? And what would that take? Christian's mission to save St. Joseph's Church started when he went to go visit his grandmother in Florida. This was a few years before he'd moved into the big red house.
I remember her face. It's a Lithuanian face. For me, I could see it from a mile away now. It's a face like a cut jewel. And you could see the overcoming of suffering in their eyes.
She was moving out of her place and told Christian,
Take everything you want. I said, I want all the family history, especially Lithuanian stuff, and I want you to tell me about it.
And so she showed him pictures of Waterbury from 1915 when houses and stores around Brooklyn were being built, of family members he'd never seen before.
I'm like, wow, this is who I am.
Christian was consumed.
I started looking up the neighborhood on Google and figuring things out and who was who and what was what. And I said, I got to go to St. Joseph's. I can't believe this place is still here.
He said his internet searches for St. Joseph's didn't turn up many results. A few obituaries and an article from a website called True Lithuania.
My priest in Canaan, Father Dawson, would come down here to Prospect, just the town over, and we would do the mass together and the readings. And we would stop at Buffalo Wild Wings because he loved that and I loved that too. And I said, that Lithuanian church is just right around the corner from here. Do you mind if we go? And we rounded that corner and I saw it and I said, I have to be here. I have to be here. And I took this picture. One thing I would do with pictures, and I still do, is I changed the color, make it more vibrant, like how God sees the world. And I just couldn't believe what was in the sky.
Christian handed me his phone.
If you look up in these clouds, you see a woman here, and her head is looking off to the right, and she has her hands in prayer, and you can see these little tiny beads, like the rosary. And around her head is a flower crown. You see that, these little dots. That's so Lithuanian. That's exactly who we are.
Do you often look for signs in things?
No, they just present themselves like this. It's proof of better things in the world to come. And be open to that. Don't shy away from it. Show it to other people. In this present time, a reserved and cautious way, but maybe that will one day change.
Christian went to his first Mass at St. Joseph's in January 2022.
And I go to the church, it's filled with Lithuanians. And I'm like, what? These are people just like me, just like my grandmother.
He felt at home, started spending more time around Waterbury, getting to know some of the Lithuanian community still hanging out in Brooklyn. He even joined a cultural organization called the Knights of Lithuania.
If you're not Lithuanian at all, you could be a part if you cared.
And then all of Christian's excitement came crashing back down to earth. The city of Waterbury had agreed to buy 3 buildings from St. Joseph's Parish: the former school, the convent, and a clubhouse. The school had undergone some upgrades around 2019, things like a new roof and gym flooring, but that was so it could house another elementary school still under construction. St. Joseph's School itself had been closed for nearly 2 decades. Regardless, the proposed deal caused a stir in the local Lithuanian community.
Once the Lithuanians lost it to the city, what would we gain, if anything?
What the St. Joseph's Parish Corporation stood to gain was about $400,000. But people like Christian and other members of the Knights of Lithuania felt like those assets, the school, the convent, and the clubhouse, were important pieces of cultural heritage. So they held meetings, called up local press, voiced their concerns to the head priest at St. Joseph's.
Father Anello made the decision to take down the St. Joseph's statue off the convent and have the contractor destroy it. And
Why?
Well, he got permission from the bishop to do so because they were deconsecrating the building. They destroyed the altar. They destroyed the cross on the top of the building.
Christian said that instead of trying to save the granite statue of St. Joseph, they smashed it in the street, just left the pieces laying there.
It was very much a spiritual attack. Really an attack by the church against the church. This is what's happening here in Waterbury. Like before my eyes, all these little ethnic churches across the city, St. Margaret of Scotland, the Polish church, St. Stanislaus, and then eventually St. Peter and Paul, Sacred Heart, all these little tiny beautiful churches were being destroyed. The foundation of people's lives, where their ancestors first set foot in this country, gone. And I'm like, I can't let this happen to St. Joseph's.
Did you think Christian ever had a shot to keep the church from closing?
No.
This is Lillian Benisavich.
He was just so excited finding a new thing. You're the first person, and you're like, oh my God, I love this so much. But I didn't want him to break his heart and say, it's not going to happen.
One of the reasons she was skeptical about whether Christian could pull it off, saving the church, is that Brooklyn is not a new thing for her. Lillian was born there in the late 50s, right after a flood wiped out about half the neighborhood.
Brooklyn was a world unto itself. If you didn't have a Lithuanian grandmother making pickles at the end of the summer, you went to your friend's house whose Italian grandfather was making wine in their driveway.
Lillian grew up watching her dad play cards and drink beer with priests from St. Joseph's on her grandmother's back porch. Said the priest used to cheat all the time.
So you said you don't speak Lithuanian well. Why is that?
When my brother was born in 1952, they lived in Brooklyn along the railroad tracks on Riverside Street. And that's when Brooklyn was still like at the height of being a Lithuanian village unto itself. And then when I was born, my grandmothers and my parents were discussing me. And my grandmothers were saying, well, there's no more little Lithuania. She says, the world is going to change for all of us. So we're going to raise her as an American.
Despite the fact that things were changing in Brooklyn, the old country still left its mark on Lillian. Her grandparents were poor, emigrated from Lithuania in the early 1900s to work at the brass mills in Waterbury. Lillian said she can still hear her grandmother's voice when she shops at the grocery store.
Ne atidaryk akis, atidaryk kišenes. That means if you don't open your eyes, you're going to open your pocket.
And so she's pragmatic, talks pretty tough. Eastern Europe is not a joyous place, she told me.
As my father and uncles always said, I'm a peasant girl 3rd class. It's okay to be emotional, but you just can't lie down and say, oh, no one loves me. I don't have a cashmere scarf. The cows need to be milked. Wipe the tears from your eyes and go milk the cows.
Do you think people have lost that a little bit?
Yes. Oh, please. Even people I know who are Lithuanian, who I grew up with, their children, my grandmothers would slap them. I'm sorry.
When Lillian went to college at a liberal arts school up the road in Hartford, she was self-conscious about her blue-collar upbringing, thought the other students saw her as white trash. But for all the dumping on Brooklyn and Waterbury, Lillian said that even the local newspaper called it the grittiest neighborhood in one of the grittiest cities in Connecticut. She still felt deeply connected to the spirit of the place.
You had adults who were in charge of each park, and my first year out of college, I was a counselor in a park, and there were like pigtail and ponytail softball league for girls, and you had singing competitions, and there was always something to do around here. It sounds a lot like Leave It to Beaver, but it was. It's just a feeling around that you inhaled, and you didn't realize that until you left this kind of thing.
Lillian lived in Hartford for about 10 years after graduating college, worked as an insurance agent for travelers. But when her dad passed away, she came back to live with her mom in Waterbury. It was the same 2-story, colonial-style house that her grandparents built after the 1952 flood, the same one she grew up in.
What in this house reminds you of your mother?
It's everything.
It really was everything. Lillian's home is like a time capsule. There's an old jukebox stereo in the living room, and her brother's drawings are still clinging to the walls. Lillian even uses an old TV antenna because she refuses to buy cable. What's there to watch on television? She asked me.
I think it's like anybody who lives with somebody for a long time. They don't realize that they've picked up their traits, habits, vocabulary.
As Lillian and her mom grew old in that house together, the Lithuanian population in Waterbury started to shrink. Stores closed. People got married to Italians or Germans or Puerto Ricans, moved to the suburbs.
Since you're one of the people that has stayed, did you feel at some point like you had been forgotten?
No. Not forgotten, but just... I was a person who was left behind. Everybody found a different place. But, my place was here. I had to take care of my mom. I had this house. I worked in the area. It's like, do I wish I could, go live in Westport, Connecticut, in the $1 million houses? Who doesn't? That's why people buy Mega Million tickets. But this is what it was. What am I missing that you should feel sorry for me?
Was there a point at which it became clear to you that it was on its last?
Oh, probably in the 80s. When a bigger proportion of the deaths were people of my parents' age, the greatest generation, when they started dying out or being too sick to come. You could say there's not really many people that were backfilling. Even my mother says it will close eventually because the generations after it didn't feel a need to be tied to the church.
At its height, Lillian said that St. Joseph's had more than 5,000 people on its books. In 2020, that number was less than 100. Even fewer showed up for Mass.
My mother was getting old. God, she's going to come back to haunt me tonight. She was literally born across the street from the church. They walked her across the street to be baptized. And she says, I want to be walked across the street to be buried.
By the time the COVID-19 pandemic was in full swing, Lillian's mom was going on 102 years old. And like basically every other church in the world, St. Joseph's was shut down for regular services. Lillian's mom wondered if that meant for good.
She says, keep St. Joseph's open until I can be buried out of it. And I said, I'm going to do all I can.
Lillian was a prominent member of St. Joseph's. She was on the parish council for 30 years, served as a trustee for another 15. But with all the on-again, off-again public health mandates, it's not like she had the power to just throw the doors back open. Said she told her mom, if I could talk to the bishop, I would. But her hands were tied.
So Mother's Day, we had a picnic outside. I'd grilled and everything, but 3 days later, she was like in pain and just crying and everything.
Her mom's condition was getting worse. At first, Lillian brought her into the hospital, but eventually decided to move her into a nursing home instead.
The nurse's aides put her in a chair next to a window, opened the window, and I talked to her through it. And the day before she died, they announced they opened the churches for funerals. I said, Mom, you're going out of St. Joseph's. It's still open, and they just allowed funerals. And that's it. I said, it's open. We could have a funeral mass. She literally died the next day. I think she waited until I told her. And she was the first funeral after they opened the churches for COVID.
Even though the church had reopened for funeral services after COVID, St. Joseph's was still facing the same problems as before. Not enough people, not enough dough. But Christian still felt like he had a shot to save it.
It was an incredibly painful, horrible time. And a time that I've come to reflect on as my Job moment.
Life was hectic for Christian during the summer of 2023. He was campaigning for an elected position back in Canaan called First Selectman. That's basically New England's version of a city council member. Plus, he was running a landscaping business that had him driving all over the state.
It was August 23rd, and we were stopped at a McDonald's on the New York border. And we got a text message from Mary Gludenis' daughter, Marianne Gludenis.
Marianne is a parishioner at St. Joseph's. Had attended the church her whole life.
She messaged us that St. Joseph's was to close and the last Mass would be held the last week of September. No consent of the parishioners, no discussion, just gone.
Christian was incensed.
I felt the world was falling out from under me. September 5th, my girlfriend broke up with me, so I had lost everything. I lost my girlfriend, basically lost the election in Canaan and my reputation, good reputation in Canaan, and lost this church I'd been fighting for.
So were the 60 or so members, he said, that were still part of the church. Remember, this was August 23rd. That meant they basically had 1 month until St. Joseph's closed its doors for good. The fact that other ethnic churches around town were going down probably wasn't a good sign, but they still felt blindsided by the announcement.
So I talked with the people out in Pennsylvania, and they told me exactly what to do, because they've been through it before.
Christian had contacted Lithuanian parishes in a few different cities, including one that was torn down back in 2010 in a small coal mining town called Shenandoah. They told him the first thing he should do is get in touch with a canon attorney. That's someone who handles legal questions about a church, stuff that's not governed by civil law, like the buying and selling of property, or the closing of a church.
First, a canon case goes before the archbishop. If it cannot be reconciled within the archdiocese, it goes to the Vatican. So they had known that this is where we're at. And so I worked with the canon attorney to write up a case and let the world know through the press that we were going that way.
Christian's case to the archbishop was basically this. You didn't let us know this was happening. You didn't ask for our consent. The process for closing this church, it's all wrong.
And at this time, you thought there was a chance that you could still, like, save the church, essentially.
I had no idea.
Good morning. Labaseritas.
Can you read some of that for me?
The rain and the gray skies outside matched the parishioners' sad feelings inside St. Joseph's Church on Sunday morning as its final Mass was celebrated.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Today we celebrate the last Mass here at St. Joseph's. For those of you who have dedicated your entire life to this parish, I'm sure today is a very sad occasion.
160 people came, reported on the front page of the Republican American, and announced at that Mass that it was the last Mass.
And believe me, when I say I find it hard to believe. It will be a big change in my life, but it is a chapter I have to accept.
And there was this sad little poster inside the church. Last Mass at St. Joseph's done in Sharpie, and these old, color copies of a inkjet printer pasted on it. It was horrible. It was just horrible. I couldn't believe it was real.
God, however, has his reasons for everything. And though we don't quite understand what's taking place in our society today, there is definitely a reason.
It says, Christian Allyn, a parishioner, has hired an attorney to appeal the decision and petition the Vatican to overturn the Archbishop's decision, which is not going to happen because this Archbishop was specifically put here to close churches.
So Christian never had a chance.
Never. I applaud his enthusiasm and his spirit, but reality is an ugly thing.
So tell me about the fight to keep the church open in its last days.
Yeah, well, it's not last days. It's still open.
Here's what happened. Christians' appeal to the Archbishop failed. They weren't going to keep St. Joseph's open for regular Sunday services. Instead, they merged with Our Lady of Mount Carmel. That's the Italian version of St. Joseph's, a Catholic church just up the hill in Waterbury. The two now hold joint masses together each week.
Monsignor Guerrera, who is now the pastor of both St. Joseph's and Mount Carmel, announced that St. Joseph's was not closed and it will not be closed. What? Everybody's like looking around, and he goes, it was not decreed as such, and to close the church is a whole other process than merging a parish. There'll be no regular masses there, but it's not closed.
Even Christian will admit that this next part is a little confusing. Ticky-tacky canon law. Despite the fact that St. Joseph's Parish had merged with Our Lady of Mount Carmel and was no longer holding weekly Mass at the big red brick church on a Flatiron Street in Waterbury, the Archbishop couldn't officially close the building.
And it was a very difficult and confusing time. But we realized that at minimum, you have to have 2 Masses a year. One during the week of the patron saint, and the other during the week that the church was consecrated.
Without a decree to deconsecrate the church from the Archbishop, that is, to basically say it's no longer sacred, St. Joseph's was still required to hold 2 Masses a year under canon law.
So the first Mass of that new era happened, I believe it was March 17th. It was St. Patrick's Day. It's like, whoa, like talk about good luck, And we got the word out there. We were like, we're not closed. We're not closed. We're having a Mass. We got 101 people there. We had people that hadn't been to church for 40 years. Kids. People in their 40s and 50s. And it was beautiful. And I saw it all from the choir loft because that's where I got invited up to go often in Mass and go up there and sing. And you see all these young people looking around. And them recognizing they're Lithuanian like me. That's what we are.
Even in this limited capacity, the doors at St. Joseph's remain open. For now.
My goal at this point is to get some sort of regular programming happening at St. Joseph's. And then to have maybe a Mass there once a month. Just once a month. It doesn't have to be regular, Let's just start with once a month and see how many people come.
As for Lillian, she's still trying to find her way. She enjoyed the last service at St. Joseph's, even if it was a sad occasion. People came from all over the Northeast to send it off. One of our producers even talked to a woman who drove all the way from Chicago to be a part of the final celebration.
I felt good that they didn't forget. I was always here. Sometimes I wish I could have forgotten when some things came up. But it was nice to see them as saying, it's like, wow, it really hasn't changed since I've been gone. Well, the only thing that changed is there's less people. And the priest doesn't speak Lithuanian. But other than that, we didn't change. The church didn't change.
You say you don't go to church now every Sunday anymore. Why not?
Because I'm trying to find my place. St. Joseph's, even I didn't want to go, I'd see people I wanted to see. And it was comforting. And I would close my eyes and I could see where I sat my entire life. If I would go to another church, I would sit there by myself. I just felt part of it. And I felt the faith. Because the women and people who were there had the same type of faith when they went to Mass, and you could feel it.
The final service was made possible with generous support from the Henry Luce Foundation and is distributed by PRX. It was written and produced by me, Mateo Schimpf, with additional writing and reporting from Ray Suarez. I also engineered and mixed the series. Joshua Dudley recorded the sounds you heard from the last Mass at St. Joseph's. And a huge shout out to Elise Manukian and Sienna Barnes, who played a massive role in developing the final service. They also provided editing and production support on this episode. My editor and executive producer is Jared Sport. Music is from Blue Dot Sessions.